She stood at the doorstep, holding the letter from the HOA, heart pounding. The demands were brutal: comply or face fines and a lawsuit. But what happened next shattered everything they thought they knew. But let's start from the beginning. Jessica Thompson had always found solace in her garden. Every morning, as the sun rose, she would step outside, inhaling the fresh scent of earth, her hands brushing over the soft petals of her flowers. The garden was more than just a patch of land. It was her sanctuary, a place where she could forget about the pressures of her demanding job and her hectic family life. The flowers, vibrant and full of life, seemed to mirror her own quiet joy. Neighbors often stopped by, offering compliments on how well she tended to it, admiring the symmetry of the herbs, the burst of color from the roses and daisies, and the healthy vegetables that lined the edges. For years, her garden was her pride, a living reflection of her care and attention to detail. It brought her peace, and for the most part, it seemed like everyone around her appreciated it too. That was until the day everything changed. The letter arrived unexpectedly, sealed with the harsh official emblem of the Homeowners Association. Jessica tore it open, expecting a simple notice about routine maintenance or perhaps a neighborhood meeting. But what she read left her stunned. The HOA demanded that she dismantle her garden, citing a vague clause about aesthetic conformity and regulations that prohibited any alterations to the property. The words on the paper seemed almost too harsh to comprehend. How could her garden, something that brought beauty and life to her home, be considered a violation? It wasn't an eyesore. It was the opposite, in fact, one of the most admired features in the neighborhood. But according to the HOA, the rows of flowers, the carefully curated herbs, and the vegetable garden were an unacceptable deviation from the prescribed look of the community. As Jessica reread the letter, the weight of their threat hit her. A fine, a lawsuit, all for a garden she had lovingly cultivated. She felt the stress and frustration rise. Why her? Why now? There had been no complaints, no issues. This was an attack, plain and simple, on something that brought her so much joy. And yet all she could do was sit there, the reality of it sinking in. Her beloved garden might soon be gone. As the deadline drew closer, Jessica's frustration reached a boiling point. Every day the pressure weighed heavier on her. She had tried repeatedly to reason with the HOA, pleading that her garden was carefully tended, aesthetically pleasing, and posed no harm to anyone. But the board members remained resolute, their faces impassive and their voices cold. "It's the rules," they said, as though that single phrase could justify their cruelty. Her love for her garden meant nothing to them. What mattered was the rigid conformity to their arbitrary standards, standards that had no room for individuality or beauty, that didn't fit their narrow vision. Jessica couldn't understand how something so simple, so innocuous, had become such a battle. Her neighbors, who once admired the garden, now looked the other way. None of them offered to speak up on her behalf. Perhaps they feared the wrath of the HOA, or maybe they simply didn't care enough to get involved. Either way, Jessica felt abandoned, isolated in her fight. The silence from the very people who had once praised her garden stung deeply, amplifying her sense of betrayal. With each new warning letter the HOA sent, the weight of their threat grew heavier. The letters weren't just about the garden anymore. They felt like personal attacks. Fines, legal threats. Nothing was off the table. The once serene space that had brought her comfort now felt like a battlefield, one where she stood alone, fighting for the right to keep something she loved. And then, one afternoon, in a surge of frustration, Jessica snapped. She grabbed the weeds by the roots and yanked them out with a fury that surprised even herself. Each pull was a mix of defiance and desperation. The action, though small, felt like a statement, But as she worked, she began to ask herself, why am I giving up without a fight? The question lingered in her mind like a spark that might ignite something bigger. The garden that had always been a symbol of peace now represented a battle she wasn't ready to lose without a fight. The day Jessica walked into the HOA office to contest the order marked a turning point. Her heart pounded as she stepped through the doors, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. She was no longer the passive gardener tending to her peaceful oasis. Today, she was a woman prepared to fight for what was rightfully hers. Determination burned in her eyes as she stood before the board members, ready to make her case. But as she spoke, explaining why her garden didn't violate any reasonable standard, the members barely acknowledged her words. Their expressions were cold, their eyes indifferent, as if they had already decided her fate before she even opened her mouth. Mr. Carson, the head of the board, leaned back in his chair with a smug smirk, his arms crossed. "Rules are rules," he said, the words dripping with condescension. "You'll have to comply or we'll take further action." His tone, dismissive and final, made it clear there would be no compromise. Jessica felt a surge of anger rising in her chest. It wasn't just about the garden anymore. It was about power. This was no longer a conversation about her property or her love for gardening. It was about a group of people hiding behind their rules to exert control over her life. She realized, in that instant, that she wasn't dealing with a committee of reasonable individuals trying to maintain order in the community. No, they weren't interested in fairness or compromise. They were driven by a need to dominate, to impose their vision on everyone else. And Jessica wasn't going to let them have that power over her. Her mind raced, the anger boiling inside her, and a quiet resolve settled within her. I won't let them win. The decision was made. Her lawyer, Kevin Rodriguez, had always been a calm, measured man, but when Jessica shared the details of the meeting with him, he was incensed. He had handled property rights cases before and knew exactly how far the HOA could go to force compliance. With his support, Jessica felt a renewed sense of purpose. Together, they would fight back. This wasn't over yet. She would take them to court. Weeks later, the courtroom battle was underway. Jessica stood firm, recounting how her garden brought beauty and joy to her family and the community. She presented photos, testimonies from neighbors who adored the garden, and even expert opinions about how well maintained it was. The HOA, on the other hand, only presented their cold, rigid rules and regulations, but no real evidence that the garden caused harm. They seemed certain they would win, but Jessica's heart raced as the judge took his time considering the evidence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge's verdict came. "The HOA has overstepped," he declared. "Their demands were unjust and unreasonable." Not only was Jessica allowed to keep her garden, but the court ruled that the HOA would have to pay for the damages caused by their harassment. As the ruling was read, Jessica felt a rush of relief and triumph. The years of being silenced by authority, the mounting stress, and the feelings of helplessness had all culminated in this victory. The HOA, once so powerful, now had to face the consequences of their actions. Jessica smiled as she walked out of the courtroom. She had won, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been bullied by an unjust system.